Thank you, Rose, and today I would like to talk about Aphesis by Mr. Treydon Lunot, a book that he has published, 2021, Vancouver, Canada. Trey is behind Telosbound, and Trey is a magnificent reader of philosophy. His videos are tremendous. His presentations are excellent on Zizek, on object-oriented philosophy. I could go on. Magnificent work. The texts that he deals with are very difficult, and he presents them in a very crisp, clear, and elegant manner. He's also a tremendous conversationalist. I had the pleasure of speaking with him. His interviews, McGowan is on Hegel, Emancipation, is tremendous. I highly suggest his work, and I greatly enjoyed his book, and I think you should go and buy it and that you should read it. Mr. Chad Haag has already done a really great review of this text, and I'm a fan of Mr. Haag's work, so I would also send you over to his channel to listen. I just want to point out some thoughts and ideas in the text that I think are brilliant, that are very well constructed. For example, Trey will open the text with a critique of the idea that we can't prove the external world. How do we know that the external world even exists? And, you know, the book opens with the idea that, well, in order to think, in order for your subjectivity to operate, it's going to require time. You know, one thought has to follow the next. Subjectivity operates according to time. Well, time is part of the external world. We can't necessarily say that the space of the external world can enter us, but time enters us. Time is going on in our brain, and therefore we require the external world to think the thought that the external world is not there, because the thought has to operate in a progress through time, and if time could not enter us per se, if we were not operating according to time, we could not think the thoughts about if the external world is out there or not. I thought this was a brilliant line of reasoning. Now, again, we could say, well, actually, there's an inner time that's distinct from the outside time, and how do you prove that there isn't a distinction between inner time and outside time, and so on and so forth? And Trey acknowledges this and notes that we can't, this is not necessarily going to disprove that the external world doesn't exist, but it's certainly going to put the idea that it doesn't exist with equal footing of it existing. And I think this is very important because it starts to reorganize and reorient the seriousness by which we take the external world. I mean, if we live in a world that even has a question mark, and even a kind of slight advantage to the idea that the external world is out there, then it becomes easy to focus on the self, individualistic, and to become very Cartesian. So even if we all kind of chuckle and laugh and say, well, of course we know the external world exists, the very fact that we have lacked or don't always have good arguments to secure ourselves in that belief can contribute to us becoming individualistic, and that can be a real problem. The book is full of analysis on Hegel, Zizek, on the self-relating negativity, all these different parts. He has a great section where he talks about how in Hegel to understand the absolute knowing, where, for example, in Hegel, the very fact that you have Kant's distinction between the thing in of itself and the phenomenon, the very fact that that distinction exists is something that thinking has presented to itself, and the very fact that it's presented itself a limit is only meaningful if there's something on the other side of the limit, and therefore consciousness, precisely in the awareness of a divide between the way it takes in the world and the world to itself, then learns about itself. It learns that furthermore, this would suggest that there is an external world, even if we can't know it well. The fact that if the noumenon exists, there has to be something external would suggest that it is there. But that this limit in of itself is then something according to which consciousness can operate and form itself, so it can achieve absolute knowing, ultimately. It becomes also, Mr. Lunot on page 44 has this nice line where he says it has the consciousness, it has no access to its limits, only its limitless self-experience. Its ontological finitude consists in its phenomenological infinitude. What's so interesting about this idea in Hegel that Mr. Lunot, Trey, is describing is the idea that consciousness, because it precisely experiences itself as absolute, as having no limits, that precisely suggests that it's incapable of experiencing limits, and therefore means it's limited. It cannot experience its own limit, therefore it is limited. Therefore the experience of infinitude is evidence of finitude, and that's the trick, that's the turn of absolute knowing. knowing. And what's funny as well is on page 43 it has this line where it says, the subject introduces untruth into the world, which then plays off Zizek, of course. But it's the idea that the subject experiences itself as absolute, as infinite, which is an experience due to its very inability to experience its limits. And so there's an untruth that is at the foundation of the absolutism of the subject. And it's just that Trey explains these things so well. He recently has started reading Heidegger, and the way that he explains Heidegger, I think, just makes so many college professors look pitiful. So just Trey is a tremendous reader, tremendous thinker. I could go on. There was this also part where he talked about, in Chad's work, is that he's going to describe how natural resources affect our understanding of time and our metaphysics. So if you exist in an agricultural society, time is more circular. It goes in seasons, fall, winter, spring, summer, and it happens again. So you have a sense where your metaphysics are going to become very circular. They're going to have a more circular air, and therefore the formation of the subject, and so on and so forth. If you, though, have fossil fuels, which are kind of you use them up and you get more energy and GDP, and you're heading toward a peak oil, but there's a kind of upward slope. So there's a line, and Trey describes this very, very well. Therefore, you're going to have a progressive metaphysics. And, I couldn't help but think, if there's something about time that's able to enter the mind and therefore give us reason to think that the external world is really there, then there's something about consciousness that is radically a time consciousness. Time binding and time consciousness is a phrase in the book. Well, funny enough, time is really hooked up with natural resource. There's something about where subjectivity is a natural resource, where the self is a natural resource. It's radically structured and organized by natural resource. And so then you could almost say that the goal in the formation of the self is to not be a natural resource, is to not be made in the image and likeness of natural resources, but instead to perhaps be made in the image of divine resources or divine sources as opposed to natural sources. And on that, I would also note, I think Trey does an extremely good job of seeing how the thinking of a Zizek, some of these modern philosophers actually have implications for Christian theology, for the doctrine of the fall, for the doctrine of the self, which I think there is not nearly enough work in theology appreciating this point. And someone like Trey is really connecting these fields that desperately needed to be connected. There have been Christian existentialists, Marcel, I guess we could say Blondel and Action, but connecting Zizek with the doctrine of the fall, the self-relating negativity, I think is a really, really important move. And it's funny to think if indeed the self tends to structure itself in terms of natural resources, then following Trey's line of argument, you would want to instead construct it based on a divine resource or a divine source as opposed to a finite or natural source or resource. And also, if time, the very fact that we require time for consciousness to think the thought, does the external world exist, if indeed the Christian theological tradition of associating God with a kind of eternity, with a kind of new time, and sort of the importance of time and the redeeming of time, then it would make sense, furthermore, that time would be a sort of escape from being stuck wondering if the external world is actually out there. There's a way in which this new appreciation of the role of time in verifying the external world is a way that time is redeemed, and it's the redeeming of the time. So in my head, those went together. But anyway, I highly suggest Telosbound. I highly suggest Trey's work. I think he's doing wonderful work. He's had a wonderful discussion with Samuel Barnes. Samuel Barnes over at his channel does mutually assured discussion. I suggest his work highly. And it's really just wonderful to go on YouTube and to find people like Trey at Telosbound doing this kind of work, because it makes the world a better place.